She was only a teenager when she was led through 3 SS checkpoints and into Adolf Hitler's private fortress in the Alps. She was just 17 when she entered Adolf Hitler's private fortress in the Alps. For 80 years, she said nothing, but now the world is finally hearing what she saw. Midnight arguments about extermination camps, staff who vanished overnight, and a dictator on substances paranoid and falling apart. She watched Eva Braun give silent orders in stolen jewelry, and she ran through fire as the Berghof burned to the ground. This is the truth from the maid who lived it and stayed silent. Until now, let's discover the innocent teen who walked into hell. She was just a teenager when she entered Adolf Hitler's private world. No weapons, no uniform, just an apron and a job application. She thought she was signing up to clean a mountain guest house. Instead, she walked into one of the most secretive, terrifying strongholds in Nazi Germany, the Berghof. She was 17. She didn't know the truth about what she was stepping into until it was too late. Why was she taken through armed SS checkpoints? Why were staff disappearing without warning? And what did she see that made her stay silent for nearly 80 years? Elisabeth Kallhammer was born in Salzburg, Austria, and like many girls her age during wartime, she was looking for work to help support her family. In 1943, she spotted a small newspaper ad. Maid wanted. Location Berghof, Obersalzberg. There was nothing unusual about it. No mention of who owned the residence. No suggestion that the job came with extreme risks. Just a name, Berghof, and a location in the Alps. To an ordinary young Austrian girl, it sounded like housekeeping in a scenic home tucked into the mountains. The sort of place you'd go to get away from the war, not become entangled in it. She accepted the offer, and within days, Elisabeth was being transported to the Obersalzberg in southern Germany. But something felt wrong almost immediately. She passed through not 1, not 2, but 3 heavily armed checkpoints guarded by SS soldiers. These weren't standard domestic arrangements. She wasn't entering a household. She was entering a fortress. And not just any fortress. The personal command center of Adolf Hitler himself. The Berghof was perched high above the village of Berchtesgaden, nestled in the Bavarian Alps. From the outside, it looked like paradise. Snow-capped mountains stretched across the horizon. Lush green valleys rolled below. The air was crisp. The sun filtered through pine trees, and the estate itself had enormous picture windows framing the view like a postcard. But that breathtaking scenery hid something else, something monstrous. Inside those halls, the decisions that led to millions of deaths were being made in real time. This was not simply Hitler's vacation home. It was a nerve center of the Nazi regime. Hitler spent more time here than almost anywhere else during the war. The Berghof was where generals were summoned, where propaganda was reviewed, where strategy meetings turned into death sentences. Plans for the Eastern Front, the invasion of Poland, and even the final solution were discussed just rooms away from where Elisabeth dusted furniture and served meals. She was never told what was happening. No one explained. No one needed to. The silence inside the Berghof wasn't an accident. It was policy. The staff were told early on, speak only when spoken to. Don't look directly at the Führer. Ask no questions. And above all, do not talk about what you see. Not here. Not outside. Not ever. Why didn't she leave because she was 17? Alone and surrounded by men with guns. At the Berghof, even asking a question could make you disappear. One day a maid would be folding laundry beside her. The next, her room was cleared, and her name never spoken again. The fear was constant. Hitler's presence was felt even when he wasn't there. His routines controlled the house. His mood shifts made the air heavy. Beneath the polished silverware and looted paintings was a silence built on dread. Elisabeth heard muffled arguments, saw maps, lists, ash on uniforms. She didn't understand everything, but she knew enough to be terrified. This wasn't just work. It was survival. For decades, she stayed silent. Now she's speaking. And what she's revealing, what she saw just beyond the next door, is darker than anyone imagined. What Kalhammer just revealed. In what experts are calling one of the most significant eyewitness accounts to emerge in recent years, former maid Elizabeth Kalhammer has finally spoken publicly about what she saw inside Adolf Hitler's inner circle. Her revelations are not just interesting, they're deeply disturbing. She has described late-night meetings where the Holocaust was discussed in panicked whispers. She recalls staff who vanished into thin air. She reveals Hitler himself physically decaying, mentally unstable, and increasingly detached from reality. So why is the world only hearing about this now? And what does it mean when a dictator's most dangerous secrets are finally exposed, not by a general, not by a soldier, but by a teenage maid? When Elizabeth Kalhammer turned 99, something changed. For nearly 8 decades, she had refused to speak publicly about her time at the Berghof, Adolf Hitler's private Alpine residence. She declined interviews. She avoided reporters. Even her closest friends and family knew very little. The silence wasn't just personal, it had been enforced. From the moment she stepped into that estate in 1943, she was warned, "You are here to work, not to talk." And for many years, she obeyed. But as she approached her 100th birthday, Elizabeth made a decision. "Before I die, I must speak," she said. "Die, I must speak," she declared. And now we finally hear the truth. In an interview that has now gone viral across Europe and beyond, the weight of what she saw and the fear that came with it had finally grown heavier than her silence. And what she revealed was unlike anything historians had heard before. Perhaps the most jarring detail was a memory that had haunted her for years. A late-night shouting match between Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler, 3 of the most powerful men in the Nazi regime. The meeting took place well past midnight. Kalhammer hadn't been allowed near the room, but she heard them through the walls. Their voices weren't just loud, they were desperate. She remembers the tone, panic, urgency, and raw fury. She didn't understand every word at the time, but she later realized what it was about. The extermination camps. The Nazis were arguing about how to manage the so-called final solution as the war turned against them. This was not a meeting recorded in any official document. No minutes were taken. No witness accounts existed until now. Kalhammer's memory of that night adds a new layer of evidence to what was happening behind closed doors during the final years of the war. These were not calm, strategic discussions. They were chaotic. They were emotional. They were unraveling. Another disturbing pattern Kalhammer described was the sudden and unexplained disappearance of fellow staff members. One day, a maid would be folding laundry next to her, and the next day, she was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Her room emptied out. Her name never mentioned again. This didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly. Elizabeth learned quickly not to ask questions. To ask was to risk becoming the next one to vanish. And then there was Hitler himself. Kalhammer had seen him up close, not in speeches or newsreels, but walking the halls, sitting in silence, or erupting in sudden bursts of rage. She remembers how his hands would tremble, how he would mutter to himself, how his moods shifted without warning. One moment he was calm and smiling. The next he was shouting over a napkin folded the wrong way. She noticed his physical decline, his posture hunched, his gait unsteady, his skin pale and dry. More disturbingly, she noticed his psychological deterioration. He became obsessed with routine. Every meal had to be served at precisely the same time. He refused to drink cold water. Every item on his plate had to be inspected and tasted beforehand. Even the wallpaper in certain rooms was chosen to avoid triggering his sensitivities. Kalhammer described how his paranoia ruled the Berghof like an invisible fog. He was convinced that spies had infiltrated his staff. He feared poisoning. He feared betrayal. He read only materials approved by a tight inner circle. He cut off old friends for saying the wrong thing. Even a glance in the wrong direction could trigger suspicion. His control extended to every corner of his world, yet he himself was clearly unraveling from within. One striking detail that Kalhammer shared was about Hitler's dependence on medication. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, gave him a cocktail of more than 70 substances daily. These included barbiturates, stimulants, sedatives, hormones, and even laced eye drops. Kalhammer didn't know the names of the illicit chemicals at the time, but she remembers how he looked after his injections. His hands would shake more, his speech would slur, and his temper would spike. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a steady decline. This version of Hitler, the frail, delusional, substance-dependent recluse, is far from the calculated image presented in official Nazi propaganda. And it's also a major challenge to how many people still imagine him. A brilliant tactician, a disciplined strategist, a master manipulator. Kalhammer saw something very different. She saw a man who had built a world of strict rules and rituals, not out of strength but out of fear. A man who yelled at servants but hid from bad news. A man who whispered about mass death in one breath and demanded cake in the next. It's easy to forget that history isn't only written in documents and archives. Sometimes it lives in the memory of someone who was simply in the room. Kalhammer never held political power. She never gave an order. But she was there. She cleaned the floors of the rooms where Nazi leaders made their darkest decisions. She served food to men who would later be tried for crimes against humanity. And what she saw contradicts many of the sanitized or strategic images we've been left with. Her story is already influencing how historians view the final years of Hitler's rule, not just because of the content, but because of the tone, the confusion, the anxiety, the psychological chaos at the core of the Nazi command structure. It wasn't just soldiers and generals, it was also ordinary people, maids, cooks, drivers, living in silence, witnessing horror, and afraid to breathe too loudly, behind closed doors. From the moment she stepped through the front doors of the Berghof, Elizabeth was struck by how controlled everything was. The estate operated with machine-like precision. Meals were served at the exact same time every day. Floors were swept on a strict rotation. Uniforms were ironed to perfection. Conversations were measured. Laughter was rare. But this wasn't just about cleanliness or efficiency. It was about control. The kind of control that came from paranoia, not discipline. Everyone who worked inside the Berghof was constantly watched. Guards monitored their movements. Senior maids reported any deviation from routine. No one was allowed to move freely through the building. Staff had designated quarters. They were not to linger in the hallways. They were not to knock on closed doors. Most rooms were off limits. Hitler's private study, for instance, was treated as sacred ground. No one entered, not even to clean, unless ordered directly. Communication among staff was minimal. People spoke in whispers, sometimes with hand signals. Anything that might be overheard could be misinterpreted, and misinterpretation could be fatal. Elizabeth quickly learned that asking questions was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. Even simple curiosity about why a room was suddenly locked or why a staff member hadn't returned was considered suspicious behavior. The atmosphere was so tense that Elizabeth described it as physically perceptible. The air would change when he entered the room, she later said. It wasn't just metaphorical. People froze. Conversations stopped. Every movement became sharper, more deliberate. Those who had worked there longer would position themselves carefully. Backs, straight hands, clasped eyes cast downward. No one made eye contact with Hitler. It was an unwritten rule. To look him in the eyes was considered disrespectful, if not threatening. And while he rarely spoke to junior staff, his presence was always overwhelming. Even meals, something that should have provided a moment of relief, were dominated by fear. Every item served to Hitler had to be pre-approved, inspected, and tasted beforehand by a team of food testers. He drank only lukewarm water, prepared to exact specifications. Any deviation from routine sparked suspicion. Elizabeth remembers how one maid was reprimanded because a napkin had been folded slightly off-center. Another staff member was sent away after a fork was placed on the wrong side of a plate. One of the most unsettling stories she shares is about a broken teacup. It was a minor accident, barely a sound, but within minutes, supervisors descended. Elizabeth was told she would lose her next day off. It was the mildest punishment she had seen. Others weren't so lucky. People who made similar errors sometimes vanished from the Berghof altogether. Their rooms cleared, their names never spoken again. These weren't official firings. There was no paperwork, just silence. Why didn't they resist? Why didn't they escape? It's easy to ask those questions from a safe distance. But inside the Berghof, there was no such thing as safety. The building itself was patrolled. The grounds were surrounded by armed guards. Communication with the outside world was limited. And even if you did manage to leave, who would believe your story? Who would protect you once you told it? The isolation was total. The estate was perched high in the Bavarian Alps, remote, serene, and cut off. Snow would often block the narrow roads for days. Phone calls were monitored. Letters were censored. It was in every practical sense a sealed environment, a prison without bars. And yet the Berghof didn't look like a prison. That was part of its deception. The windows were large and filled the rooms with natural light. The furniture was elegant. The artwork, much of it stolen, was framed beautifully on the walls. Music sometimes played from the radio. Guests arrived in polished cars. Nazi officials gathered for drinks and speeches. But underneath it all, every person in that building was walking a tightrope. Even social events were carefully choreographed. Staff were assigned to serve at dinner parties, where high-ranking Nazis laughed and joked while the war outside raged on. The contradiction was hard to process. One minute you were serving pastries. The next you heard screams from a private room. Elizabeth described these moments as surreal. They weren't discussed. No one asked where the sounds were coming from. No one wanted to know. Pellhammer remembers being told early on, you are allowed to think, but not to speak. It was the closest thing to permission they were given. They could observe. They could remember. But they could not comment. They could not judge. They could not express doubt. The price of doing so wasn't just losing your job. It could mean losing everything. By the time Elizabeth had been there a few weeks, she understood this completely. Her actions became automatic. She cleaned. She served. She obeyed. She avoided eye contact. She answered questions with yes or no. She said nothing else. In this way, she lasted longer than many others. But once you've lived in a place like the Berghof, you carry it with you even after the walls have burned to the ground. The man behind the myth. Who was Adolf Hitler behind closed doors? When the cameras were off, the crowd was gone, and the speeches had stopped. Her account strips away the myth and reveals something far more disturbing: a dictator unraveling in real time. One of the first things Elizabeth noticed was his physical fragility. His posture had begun to deteriorate. He leaned slightly when he walked. His steps small and uneven. His skin was pale, almost gray at times. He rarely ventured outdoors and spent long stretches in darkened rooms. His hands trembled visibly, especially during meals. At first, she assumed it was just age or stress, but the longer she worked at the Berghof, the clearer it became. Something was deeply wrong with his body and his mind. Behind the scenes, Hitler was taking over 70 different medications each day. That figure isn't exaggeration. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, maintained a strict schedule of pills, injections, and tonics designed to manage everything from chronic digestive issues to psychological symptoms. Pellhammer, of course, didn't know the names of the substances at the time, but modern researchers have identified many of them. The list included barbiturates used as sedatives, methamphetamine-based stimulants to keep him alert, opiates for pain, and even cocaine-laced eye drops to treat sinus problems and fatigue. Some were medically appropriate by the standards of the time. Many were not. The American interrogators of Morel found out all the different 28 treatments he was giving, like the ground bull testis. Kalhammer watched the effects play out daily. After taking his doses, Hitler often seemed more animated, but not in a healthy way. His speech would quicken, his movements become erratic, his irritability spiked, and when the effects wore off, he would become lethargic, withdrawn, and sometimes unresponsive. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a cycle, substance-induced highs crashing lows, and then more medication. His body, propped up by chemicals, was beginning to betray him, and his mind wasn't far behind. One of the most jarring contradictions Kalhammer observed was in his personal habits. Hitler promoted himself as a disciplined, ascetic leader. A man of principles, he famously avoided alcohol. He claimed to be a vegetarian, supposedly out of moral conviction. Meals were designed around this narrative. Meat was banned from the Berghof's dining table. Everything was cooked to instructions. Even water had to be served lukewarm, never cold. But Elizabeth and the kitchen staff knew there were exceptions. Late at night, long after the others had gone to bed, Hitler would occasionally sneak into the pantry or the kitchen. Not for a briefing, not for an urgent meeting, but for cake. Not just any cake, Führer cake. A sweet apple and nut dessert that had been prepared specifically for him. He would eat it alone quietly, like a guilty child. Kalhammer remembered the image clearly. The man who ordered entire populations to starve was spooning dessert out of a tin tray in silence under flickering lights. This wasn't the only contradiction. Hitler micromanaged propaganda films with obsessive detail. He would spend hours reviewing footage, examining lighting, body language, and audio clarity. Speeches were timed. Gestures were choreographed. He believed visuals mattered more than facts. But when it came to actual military briefings, his attention span was uneven. He would lose focus quickly. He ignored data that didn't align with his views. Officers learned to filter what they shared. Bad news was spun as a minor setback. Unwelcome opinions were not just rejected, they were punished. Kalhammer recalls hearing fragments of conversations from behind closed doors, meetings that started calmly but often ended in shouting. Hitler was losing touch with the world outside. He insisted on reading only materials that had been cleared by his most loyal aides. Newspapers were edited. Intelligence reports were cherry-picked. He was building a version of reality that no longer reflected the actual war. And anyone who tried to correct him was either removed or silenced. By the final months of her service, Elizabeth no longer saw Hitler as a powerful figure. She saw a man unraveling in real time. His famous speeches, once thunderous and sharp, had become rambling and disconnected. Words spilled out without rhythm. His voice would trail off mid-sentence, only to spike again without warning. Sometimes he spoke to no one in particular, muttering under his breath as he stared out the Berghof's vast windows. Other times he would erupt in rage over something trivial. An improperly arranged bouquet, a noisy hallway, a misaligned chair. His fear of assassination grew by the week. He changed rooms often, sometimes multiple times a night. Staff were instructed not to walk behind him even at a distance. New food tasters were rotated in constantly. He had a bell system installed to call for guards at all hours. He flinched at unexpected sounds, even footsteps in the corridor. This wasn't strategy. This was a man who no longer trusted his own world. Elizabeth never forgot these details because they were impossible to ignore. She wasn't reading reports, she was there. She dusted the furniture he sat on. She served tea just down the hallway from his substance cabinet. She passed his trembling figure in the corridor. She heard his outbursts through the walls, and perhaps most disturbingly, she watched the people around him pretend it was normal. That normalization of decline was what struck her most. The Berghof was full of powerful men. Goebbels, Himmler, Göring. They all saw what she saw. But no one said anything. No one intervened. The system had grown so dependent on Hitler that they chose to protect the image even as the man collapsed. Kalhammer has said that she didn't know the full scale of the war at the time. She didn't know about the numbers, the camps, the gas chambers. But she knew something was deeply wrong. She saw it in the eyes of those around her. She felt it in her own body, the stiffness, the silence, the adrenaline, and she saw it most clearly in the Führer himself. Not a genius, not a master strategist, but a man losing control, hidden behind curtains, clinging to rituals, fueled by substances, and afraid of the very world he had created. This is the Hitler that few people ever saw, and now, thanks to a maid who spent her youth trying not to be noticed, the world finally knows what that looked like. The Shadow Queen. Eva Braun's real role. Who was the real Eva Braun? When Kalhammer arrived at the Berghof in 1943, she was told two things immediately. Never speak about what you see, and never assume anyone is harmless. The second rule made more sense once she encountered Eva Braun. On the surface, Eva was everything Hitler wasn't. Where he was cold and abrupt, she was cheerful and talkative. Where he was rigid and demanding, she seemed relaxed and warm. She greeted the younger maids with smiles. She asked about their families. She offered compliments on their uniforms and hair. But Kalhammer, like the others, learned quickly that Eva's warmth was calculated. It was a tool. Kalhammer recalls how Eva acted like the lady of the house. She chose which rooms would be cleaned and when. She decided what the maids would wear. She oversaw decorations for events, coordinated flowers, and arranged the seating for dinners. No detail was beneath her notice. These might seem like ordinary hostess duties, except that they were carried out inside the personal headquarters of Adolf Hitler, the place where military strategy was discussed, where the final solution was planned, and where Eva Braun lived in comfort while genocide raged just beyond the mountains. Kalhammer said that Eva was always good to me, but there was always a line you never crossed. You didn't speak casually to her, because anything said to Eva could, and often did, make its way back to Hitler. If a maid looked tired or someone was missing from the breakfast rotation, Eva would ask questions, not out of concern, but out of control. She wasn't a friend to the staff. She was surveillance with a smile. One of the most unsettling details Kalhammer remembers is Eva's jewelry. It was elaborate, expensive, often far too extravagant for casual wear. But in the Berghof, she wore it proudly. Later, Kalhammer learned that many of the pieces were likely stolen, taken from Jewish families whose homes had been looted or seized during Nazi expansion. The same was true for the silk dresses, the fine china, and the rugs on the floor. Eva dined on gourmet vegetarian meals while rationing and hunger spread across Germany. She hosted social gatherings for top Nazi officials while millions starved. Despite the luxury, Eva was not idle. She paid attention to power dynamics. When Hitler grew agitated, she was often the only one who could interrupt him without punishment. It was a skill one that suggested she understood the danger of his moods better than most of the men around him. She didn't give orders like a general, but she had influence. Subtle influence. Strategic influence. She shaped the tone of the Berghof. When she was cheerful, things felt lighter. When she was silent, staff grew anxious. When she disappeared for hours, people assumed something important was happening. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need a title. She simply existed in the right place at the right time, close to the most feared man in Europe. And she used that position carefully. Kalhammer describes a woman who lived in complete contrast to the war happening beyond the gates. While bombs fell and cities burned, Eva posed for home movies with her dogs, arranged flower vases, and planned garden parties. Her world was untouched by consequence, and yet she knew what was happening. She was in the room. She saw the officials Kalhammer did. Goebbels' Himmler spear enter and leave with pale faces and blood on their boots. She heard the same arguments behind closed doors. She saw the tension, the paranoia, the destruction, and she said nothing. Her silence wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. Because while others might have been too afraid to speak, Eva Braun had power. She had access. She had Hitler's trust. And she used it to maintain her place in a world built on cruelty. She was not screaming orders, but she didn't need to. Her job wasn't to lead. It was to make leadership more comfortable, to smooth the edges, to make the horror more livable for the people who carried it out. This is what historians call complicity through comfort. When someone benefits from a system they know is wrong and does nothing to stop it, when they make that system easier to operate, more elegant, more socially acceptable. Eva Braun may not have pulled triggers or signed decrees, but she helped build the environment in which those things happened without resistance. And that matters. To the public, Eva Braun was almost invisible. She appeared in few photographs. She was rarely mentioned in Nazi communications. Her existence was downplayed to preserve Hitler's image as a solitary, devoted leader. But to the people inside the Berghof, she was something entirely different. She was the soft edge of something sharp, the smile behind the surveillance. The woman who watched remembered and never forgot what you said. Elisabeth Kallhammer saw all of this. She didn't need to be told. She lived it. And what she describes is not a tragic love story. It's not a woman caught in the wrong place. It's a person who saw what power looked like behind the curtain and chose to stay. Eva Braun was not a symbol. She was not passive. She was not just a girlfriend. She was a power player inside one of the most brutal regimes in history. And now, through the eyes of someone who witnessed it firsthand, the world can no longer pretend she was anything less. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.